Get off my property before I call the police, my daughter-in-law shrieked, her voice slicing through the warm hum of Thanksgiving dinner like a blade through glass. She grabbed my coat off the hook and threw it at my chest hard enough to knock the wind out of me. She had forgotten whose roof was over her head. I did not shout. I did not plead. I simply picked my coat up off the floor, folded it over my arm, and smiled the kind of smile that makes a confident woman suddenly very uncertain. My name is Walter Pierce. I am 67 years old. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And if you've ever had family try to convince you that you were the problem in your own home, hit that like button and subscribe, because you are exactly who this story is for. Let me tell you how a retired forensic accountant, a man who spent 35 years finding the one number that didn't belong, almost got erased from his own family, and how I made sure that never happened again. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and a cold front had rolled into Asheville, North Carolina, turning the mountain air sharp and biting. Inside my house, the one my late wife Corinne and I built plank by plank over 3 decades, the smell of cinnamon and roasting turkey should have felt like comfort. Instead, it felt like the smell of something rotting underneath a fresh coat of paint. I spent my career finding fraud. For 35 years, companies paid me to walk into their books and find the exact place where the numbers stopped telling the truth. I could smell a cooked ledger from across a boardroom. I had built a reputation on being the man who was never fooled. And yet, in my own dining room, surrounded by my own blood, I had been the easiest mark in the world. I stood in my bedroom mirror, straightening the collar of the blue flannel shirt Corinne always said made my eyes look like the ocean. Corinne had been gone 14 months. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by June. When she died, she took the sound of the house with her. We bought this 5-acre property in the foothills back in 1994, and I paid off every dollar of the mortgage 9 years early by working weekends nobody else wanted. This was supposed to be the place I grew old in peace, listening to the creek behind the property and the wind chimes Corinne hung on the porch. I adjusted my collar, took a breath, and walked out toward the dining room to join my family for the holiday. I stopped in the doorway. The dining table Corinne and I bought at an estate auction in Charleston 22 years ago was set with a precision that made my stomach drop before my brain even understood why. I counted the plates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 place settings. 7 wine glasses. My son, Marcus, 36, was uncorking a bottle at the sideboard. His wife, Deanna, 33, was lighting candles with the kind of theatrical care people use when they know someone is watching. Deanna's parents sat near the window, murmuring to each other with the smug comfort of people who had already decided how this evening would go. And then there were the 2 men I had never seen in my life, both wearing suits that fit too well for men sitting down to a family dinner, both watching the room like appraisers at an auction. Marcus, Deanna's parents, 2 strangers. That was 7. 7 chairs at the table. No chair for me. No plate. I stood in my own doorway, feeling something cold settle into my chest. A feeling I recognized instantly because I had built a career on recognizing it in other people's businesses right before the whole structure came down. I remembered every late night I spent auditing other men's companies so I could put money away for Marcus's college, missing 2 of his baseball championships because a client in Charlotte needed a rush report. I remembered signing the final mortgage payment with Corinne sitting beside me, both of us crying a little, neither of us admitting it. I had given this family everything I had, and when Deanna's business, some subscription skincare company that never seemed to actually ship any product, needed runway, I had opened my home like an idiot opens a door for a stranger claiming car trouble. After Corinne passed, this house had felt like a museum nobody visited. Marcus and Deanna came to me with soft voices and softer eyes. They said they were worried about me rattling around alone. They said they wanted to be close, to help, to make sure I wasn't lonely in my final years. They said it would let them save capital while Deanna scaled her company. I was grieving. I was lonely in a way I didn't have words for. So I said yes. I let them in. Over the 7 months since, I had been quietly, methodically pushed toward the edges of my own life. It started small. It always starts small. They took over my home office. They moved me down to the guest room off the garage. And now, standing here on Thanksgiving looking at a table where I had been erased entirely, the truth I had been refusing to see finally kicked the door down. I was not an honored elder in this house. I was a liability waiting to be handled. Anger rose up hot and fast in my chest. but the accountant in me took over, the part of me trained never to react to a bad number, only to trace it back to its source. I did not raise my voice. I turned, walked calmly down the hallway to what used to be my study, and dragged my leather reading chair out into the corridor. The legs scraped against the hardwood with a sound loud enough to silence every voice in that dining room. I pulled the chair to the head of the table, the seat I had occupied every Thanksgiving for 22 years, and wedged it in between Deanna and one of the strange men in suits. I walked to the hutch, took a spare plate and fork, set them down, and sat. I looked at every face at that table, my own face giving nothing away. The silence was total. The two strangers exchanged uneasy glances. Deanna's parents looked at me like I had wandered in off the street. And Marcus, my son, the boy I taught to throw a curveball in this very backyard, stared down at the tablecloth, refusing to meet my eyes, too much of a coward to defend the father who built the ground he was sitting on. Deanna's face went red with fury. She shot up so fast her chair cracked against the wall. "Get off my property before I call the police," she screamed, snatching my coat from the hook by the door and hurling it at me. "This is not your dinner. You are not invited." I did not flinch. I bent down, picked up my coat, folded it neatly over my forearm, and looked at her with a slow, calm smile that made her fury falter into something close to fear. "Enjoy your dinner, Deanna," I said, my voice even. I turned and walked toward the front door. Behind me I heard Marcus mutter something to the strangers about his father's confusion lately. They thought I was retreating in shame. They thought I was walking out into the cold to lick my wounds. My hand closed around the brass doorknob, and a quiet, dangerous calm settled over me, because I wasn't leaving. I was opening that door for the people I had already asked to be waiting on the other side. To understand how I got to that door, you have to go back 7 months. To the exact week grief made me stupid. Corinne died in June, fast and cruel, the kind of cancer that doesn't negotiate. 1 month she was teaching our granddaughter how to can peaches on the back porch. 6 weeks later I was standing in a black suit watching her casket lowered into red Carolina clay. Without her, this 5-acre property felt like a monument to a life that no longer existed. I had spent 35 years reading other people's financial statements, finding the fault lines before the whole building came down. I could smell deception in a spreadsheet from across a room. But grief doesn't show up in a ledger. Grief is the one number I never learned to audit, and it left me completely undefended. It was a gray Sunday, 3 weeks after the funeral, when Marcus and Deanna came by with a bottle of wine and soft, careful voices. We sat in the living room where Corinne's reading glasses still sat on the side table because I couldn't bring myself to move them. Deanna did most of the talking. "Walter, we've been thinking," she said, her hand resting on Marcus's knee like she needed him steady. "We hate that you're out here all alone. This house is too much for one person. And honestly, my company is at a critical funding stage. If we could free up our rent money for the business for a year and be here to keep an eye on you at the same time, it just makes sense for everybody." It was a reasonable lie wrapped in a compassionate bow. They were framing their financial rescue as a sacrifice for my well-being. I should have run every number the way I'd run them for 40 years of clients. Instead, I said yes, because Marcus was the only piece of Corinne still walking around on this earth, and I wanted to hear footsteps in this house again. They moved in 4 days later. The takeover began under the friendly banner of helping. Boxes appeared. Furniture got rearranged without asking. Deanna directed the movers with the breezy confidence of someone who already owned the place. I told myself it was an adjustment period. I told myself I was a stubborn old man who needed to relearn how to share space. That illusion didn't survive their first night in the house. I'd gone for my evening walk, the same 3-mile loop I'd walked every night since Corinne died, and came home a little after 9. I punched my 4-digit code into the garage keypad, the same code I'd used for 11 years. Red light. Error. I tried again, slower this time. Red light again. On the 3rd failed attempt, the system locked and started counting down to an automatic alarm call. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs in sweatpants, entirely unbothered. He came down, reached past me, and typed a new code like he'd done it 1,000 times. "What did you do?" I asked. "Why doesn't my code work?" "Oh, sorry, Dad," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "The system glitched earlier, so Deanna had me reset it. I'll write the new numbers down for you." He said it so smoothly, so reasonably, and walked off toward the kitchen without waiting for a response. I stood alone in my own foyer, staring at a green light that suddenly felt like a taunt. You don't reset the security code of a house that isn't yours on your first night there, unless you're marking your territory. I had let something dangerous through my front gate, and it had just shown me its teeth without even bothering to hide them. Over the following weeks, the small insults accumulated into something with weight and shape. Deanna did not conquer the house with confrontation. She did it the way water finds a crack in concrete, quiet and patient until the whole structure gives. The first real casualty was my study. For 30 years that room had been mine. Floor-to-ceiling oak shelves lined with case files, financial forensics textbooks, framed certifications from the state board. Corinne used to sit by the window doing crossword puzzles while I worked. One Tuesday, I came back from the hardware store to find two men in coveralls carrying my desk out to a truck. My framed certifications were stacked in a cardboard box. One of them cracked down the glass. Deanna stood in the middle of the wreckage on a phone call, gesturing with the practiced enthusiasm of someone performing importance for an audience. She held up a finger to shush me, finished her call, and turned with a bright, empty smile. "Walter, perfect timing. I need a dedicated studio space for content shoots. Investors want to see a polished aesthetic when we do calls. This room has the best light in the house." I looked at the box holding 35 years of my professional life. "You didn't ask me," I said. She waved a hand like she was swatting a fly. "You're retired, Walter. You don't use any of this anymore. We're a family, and family means we all make sacrifices for what's best." She walked past me, patted my shoulder like I was a confused child, and disappeared toward the kitchen. I went looking for Marcus and found him in the sunroom scrolling his phone, avoiding the whole situation the way he'd been avoiding conflict his entire adult life. "Your wife just packed up my study without asking me," I said. "That's not acceptable, Marcus." He sighed like I was the exhausting one. "Dad, please don't make this a thing. Deanna's under a lot of pressure with the launch. She needs a quiet space. You can use the spare bedroom off the garage instead." "That study is mine," I said. "It holds my whole career." Marcus stood, put a hand on my shoulder in a gesture that was supposed to be comforting, and instead felt like a door closing. "Actually, Dad, we wanted to talk to you about that anyway. You've been having trouble with the stairs lately. We noticed you holding the railing last week. My knees were fine. I walked 3 miles a night without a limp. We think it makes sense for you to move into the room off the garage," Marcus continued, his eyes wide with performed concern. "No stairs. Ground level. Closer to the bathroom. It's safer for you, and honestly, it gives everybody a little more privacy. The garage room, a converted storage space with one small window and a space heater that rattled all night. They were dressing up my eviction from my own home as an act of love, weaponizing my age like it was a diagnosis. You want to move me into a storage closet?" I said flatly. "It's a lovely little suite, Dad," Deanna corrected, stepping in behind Marcus. "It's for your own good." I didn't argue. Arguing with people who've already decided the story only gives them more material to twist. I packed my clothes over 3 days, each trip down that hallway feeling like a small burial. The silence of that garage room at night was the loneliest sound I'd heard since the hospital. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Marcus would eventually see what was happening and put a stop to it. That hope didn't survive the following week. It was past 11 at night. I heard a heavy dragging sound coming from the direction of the master bedroom, the room that had been mine and Corinne's for 30 years. I got up, put on my shoes, and cracked the door to the hallway just enough to see. The front door stood wide open, cold air pouring in. Marcus was straining to push a large, heavy piece of furniture across the porch toward a rented dumpster parked at the curb. The moonlight caught the hand-painted floral pattern on the wood. It was Corinne's cedar hope chest, the one her grandmother gave her on their wedding day, the one where she kept every letter I'd ever written her during 2 deployments overseas. I had specifically told Deanna to leave it exactly where it was because it meant more to me than anything else in that house. Marcus shoved it off the edge of the porch. It tumbled down the front steps and split open on the concrete, the old cedar cracking like a rifle shot. He dragged the broken pieces to the dumpster, tossed them in, wiped his hands on his jeans, and checked his phone like nothing had happened. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, my chest hollowed out. This wasn't about space anymore. This wasn't about my knees or my safety. This was a deliberate, calculated erasure of everything that proved I had ever mattered in this house. They weren't just pushing me to the margins. They were throwing my whole life into a dumpster, one piece at a time. The next morning, I didn't confront Marcus. I sat alone with my coffee and did the thing 35 years of forensic work trained me to do. I stopped reacting and started tracing. A ledger doesn't fall apart on its own. There's always pressure applied somewhere, a motive behind every irregular entry. Marcus and Deanna were applying pressure to my life the same way a client cooks a balance sheet, one small manipulation at a time, until the whole thing looks legitimate. What was the motive underneath the cruelty of destroying Corinne's hope chest? It spoke of someone who already believed they owned everything in this house. I decided to stop being the grieving father and become what I actually was, an investigator sitting inside the crime scene. I started watching. Deanna claimed her skincare company was thriving, yet she spent an unusual amount of time monitoring the mailbox personally, something she'd never done before. Our mail carrier, a woman named Patrice, usually came around 11. Now Deanna was on the porch at 10:45 every single morning waiting for her, taking the mail directly from her hands, disappearing into what used to be my study for an hour, and only then bringing the leftover flyers and bills to the kitchen counter. Nothing of substance ever made it to me. I started asking myself why a woman running a supposedly successful company needed to personally intercept the mail like she was guarding a secret. My chance came on a cold Tuesday. Marcus and Deanna dressed up for what they called an investor lunch downtown and drove off in Deanna's SUV. As soon as their taillights disappeared down the drive, I went straight to the garage and the blue recycling bin. Deanna had bought a heavy-duty shredder for her studio, the kind used for sensitive documents, but she emptied the shredded confetti straight into our unlined recycling bin like an amateur. I scooped double handfuls of shredded paper into a garbage bag and carried it to my room off the garage. I dumped it onto the bed and turned on the lamp. It looked hopeless, 1,000 jagged white strips tangled together. But I had spent decades reconstructing torn financial records for fraud cases that hinged on exactly this kind of patience. I began sorting by paper weight and texture, setting aside the cheap printer paper and focusing on the thicker, glossier strips, corporate letterhead stock. After nearly 2 hours, I had reassembled the top corner of a document bearing the unmistakable blue logo of the credit union where Corinne and I had banked for 28 years, the same institution that held the long-since satisfied mortgage on this house. My hands were shaking as I taped fragment after fragment into place. I found a date stamped 4 days earlier. Then I found the recipient line. The name printed there wasn't Marcus Pierce. It wasn't Deanna Pierce. It was Walter Pierce. My own name, on a letter I never received, that had been intercepted and shredded by the people living under my roof. I kept working, piecing together fragments of the body text. I found the words, home equity line. I found appraised value. Finally, I assembled the center paragraph and read it aloud in the empty room, my voice cracking on every word. Congratulations, Walter. You have been approved for a home equity line of credit in the amount of $380,000. I had never applied for a loan in my life. I paid this house off in cash equity dollar by dollar over 3 decades. But my name and my signature, forged from God knows where, were sitting on an approval letter for nearly $400,000, borrowed against a house I owned free and clear. To pull that off required a forged application, a fabricated appraisal appointment I was never told about, and someone inside this house feeding my personal information to a loan officer willing to look the other way. I folded the taped fragments and hid them inside a hollowed-out hardcover book on my shelf. If they were bold enough to forge a loan against my house, what else had they already taken? There was one more thing, something worth more to me than any amount of money. Corinne's wedding ring, a modest diamond in a gold band that had been on her hand for 41 years, had come off during her final hospitalization when her fingers swelled from the treatment. I had kept it in the small, fireproof safe bolted inside our bedroom closet, the one place I trusted, absolutely. The next morning, while Deanna was on a call and Marcus was out running errands, I went up to check it. I turned the dial, heard the tumblers click into place, and opened the door. My passport and old insurance papers were untouched, but the small velvet box in the back corner was too light before I even opened it. I flipped the lid, empty. I carried the empty box downstairs, my hands trembling with a rage I hadn't felt since Corinne's diagnosis. Deanna was in the kitchen sipping a smoothie. I set the box down on the counter hard enough to make her jump. "Where is your mother-in-law's wedding ring, Deanna?" I asked, my voice low and steady in a way that surprised even me. Her face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, backing toward the sink. "The safe was locked. Only 3 people alive know that combination. Me, Marcus, and you, because I told you in case of an emergency. The ring is gone." "Maybe you moved it," she stammered. Don't accuse me in this house. Before she could invent more excuses, Marcus walked in from the garage, took one look at the empty box and Deanna's face, and immediately positioned himself between us, arms crossed, playing defender. What's going on here? He asked, his tone already accusatory toward me. Your mother's ring is missing from the safe, I told him. Deanna is the only other person with the code. Marcus let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind reserved for a child who won't stop crying over nothing. Dad, come on. Listen to yourself. You're accusing your own daughter-in-law of stealing over a piece of jewelry. You probably just misplaced it somewhere. I did not misplace it, I said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a tone dripping with fake gentleness. Dad, you've been under a lot of stress since Mom passed. Your memory hasn't been what it used to be. Don't you remember telling me last month you were worried about keeping valuables in the house, so you moved the ring to a safety deposit box downtown? I stared at him, watching my own son rewrite my reality in real time, laying groundwork brick by brick to make me doubt my own mind, to make everyone around us believe I was slipping. I looked at Deanna. She said nothing, staring at the floor, letting her husband paint me as a confused old man while she stood there wearing my dead wife's stolen ring somewhere, probably in a drawer, probably already sold. I understood in that instant that fighting back here was exactly what they wanted. If I raised my voice, if I called the police in a fury, they would use it as proof of my declining mental state. So I let my shoulders drop. I let my voice go soft and defeated. Maybe my mind is playing tricks on me. I mumbled and walked away, catching Marcus's reflection in the hallway mirror smirking at his wife like they'd just won something. That smirk told me everything. They weren't just stealing from me. They were building a case to have me declared incompetent. I decided to become exactly the fragile old man they wanted. I misplaced my glasses on purpose. I asked the same question twice within an hour and watched Deanna exchange a satisfied glance with Marcus over my head. I let them believe they'd already won, because arrogant people get careless, and careless people make mistakes you can use. On a clear, cold Thursday afternoon, I announced in a shaky voice that I was going for my walk to clear my head. Nobody looked up from what they were doing. I walked out the front door, closed it with a deliberate thud, and made it exactly to the end of the driveway, before doubling back. I slipped along the tree line at the edge of the property, circled around behind the old barn we used for storage, and came up along the side fence where the gate hinge was quiet enough not to give me away. From behind the woodpile, I could see the back patio clearly. Marcus stood in the middle of the yard with two men in suits that didn't belong anywhere near a mountain property in late November. City men, one of them smoking, the other holding a leather folder and taking notes. They weren't contractors. They weren't friends. The land alone is worth more than the structure, Marcus was saying, gesturing at the house with the confidence of a man giving a sales pitch on something he already owned. 5 acres, mountain views, no HOA restrictions. This asset is completely unencumbered once the transfer processes. The man with the folder looked up. What about the current owner? Is he going to be a problem for us on the transfer? Marcus's smile turned into something I had never seen on my son's face before, something cold and empty. Don't worry about my father, he said. That won't be an issue much longer. We're already filing the competency paperwork. Once that clears, this is entirely mine to leverage. The words hit me like a physical blow, colder than the November wind cutting through the woodpile. This wasn't just theft. This wasn't just cruelty. My own son was actively planning to have me declared legally incompetent so he could seize the deed to my home and hand it over to men who looked like they collected debts with something sharper than paperwork. I stood behind that woodpile until my legs went numb, until the men shook hands with Marcus and disappeared down the drive in a black sedan. I let myself back into the garage room, sat on the edge of the bed, and understood with total clarity that I could no longer fight this on instinct alone. A forensic accountant doesn't win a case with anger. He wins it with documentation a judge cannot argue with. I needed a lawyer, the kind of lawyer who ate men like Marcus for breakfast. The next morning I told Deanna, in the frailest voice I could manage, that I was taking the senior shuttle to the community center to play cards. She barely looked up. 3 blocks from the house, I straightened my back, called a car, and had it take me downtown to the office of a woman named Renata Kessler, an elder law attorney I'd worked alongside years earlier on a fraud case that put a nursing home administrator behind bars. I laid the shredded and taped-together loan letter on her desk, along with the story of the missing ring, the fake competency filing, and the two men in suits standing in my backyard talking about my house like it already belonged to them. Renata listened without interrupting, her expression sharpening with every sentence. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Walter, this is not a family disagreement. This is elder financial exploitation, forgery, and conspiracy. And if there's an actual competency petition being drafted, we need to move faster than they expect us to. Over the next 10 days, working quietly and carefully, we built a case. Renata subpoenaed the credit union records, which confirmed the forged loan application had been submitted using my digital signature, generated from an account created the same week Marcus and Deanna moved in. She tracked down the pawn shop 3 counties over where Corinne's ring had been sold for $1,100, a fraction of its worth, under Deanna's own driver's license. And most importantly, she filed an emergency protective motion with the court, freezing any transfer of my property and formally notifying the court that any competency filing against me would be met immediately with a counter-motion backed by documented evidence of fraud, forgery, and theft. I said nothing to Marcus or Deanna. I kept playing my part, shuffling slowly through the kitchen, misplacing my keys, letting them believe the walls were closing in on me exactly as they'd planned. Meanwhile, Renata quietly arranged for 2 sheriff's deputies from the county's elder abuse unit to be present, waiting down the road in an unmarked car. On the one night I knew both Marcus and Deanna would be in the house together with witnesses present. Thanksgiving. Which brings us back to that dining room, to the 7-place settings, to Deanna throwing my own coat at my chest and screaming that I wasn't invited to my own table. I picked up my coat, walked to the front door, and instead of leaving, I opened it and let Renata Kessler and 2 deputies from the Buncombe County Elder Services Unit step inside out of the cold. The silence that followed was the kind you could hear ringing in your ears. Deanna's face went the color of the tablecloth. The 2 strangers at the table, the men Marcus had clearly invited to finalize whatever deal he'd been cooking, stood up so fast their chairs toppled backward, already reaching for coats they hadn't finished taking off. Marcus stood frozen at the head of what he thought was now his table. "Sit down, everyone," I said, my voice carrying a calm that felt earned rather than performed. "This won't take long." Renata stepped forward and, in the flat, procedural tone of a woman who had done this 100 times, informed the room that a home equity fraud investigation was underway, that a stolen piece of jewelry had already been recovered from a pawn shop with security footage of the transaction, and that any attempt to file a competency petition against me would now be considered in direct conjunction with an active criminal fraud case. One of the strange men, the one who'd been holding the leather folder in my backyard, muttered something about this deal being dead and walked straight out into the snow without his coat. The other followed without a word. Deanna's composure finally cracked. She sank into her chair, mascara running, and reached for me across the table the way a drowning person reaches for anything solid. "Walter, please, I didn't want any of this. Marcus told me you were declining. He told me we were protecting the family. I never meant to hurt you. Please, you have to believe me." I looked down at her outstretched hand and felt nothing reach for it in return. I waited for some flicker of the old instinct to comfort, to forgive, and found the well simply dry. "You wore my late wife's ring to sell it for $1,100, I said quietly. "Nobody manipulated your hand into that pawn shop, Deanna. You walked in there yourself." She had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. I turned to my son. Marcus would not look at me. I let the silence stretch long enough that he had no choice but to finally lift his eyes. "You told 2 strangers in my backyard that I wouldn't be a problem much longer," I said. "You were going to have your own father declared incompetent to steal the house I built with your mother, plank by plank, while she was still alive to watch us build it. Blood does not give you a license to erase someone, Marcus, not even mine. I told them they had 1 hour to pack what belonged to them and leave the property, and that anything more would be handled by Renata and the deputies standing in my foyer." Marcus opened his mouth to argue and then closed it, understanding for the first time that the game he'd been playing had a referee now, and that referee was no longer confused about the score. They packed in near silence upstairs while I stood in the kitchen with Renata, listening to drawers slam and suitcase zippers tear open. 50 minutes later, Marcus came down the stairs first, refusing to meet my eyes, followed by Deanna, who paused at the door as if she might say something else, and then thought better of it. I watched their taillights disappear down the long gravel drive into the dark, the same drive Corinne and I had paved together 30 years earlier. The locksmith I had already arranged arrived 20 minutes after they left. I stood in my foyer and watched him change every lock in the house. The front door, the side entrance, the door to the garage room that had briefly been my prison. Each turn of his screwdriver felt like closing a chapter I never wanted to open in the first place. I paid him, thanked him for coming out on a holiday, and locked the new deadbolt with a solid, final click. For the first time in 7 months, I stood completely alone in my own house, and the silence didn't feel like exile anymore. It felt like mine again. I walked slowly through the rooms Corinne and I had built our whole life inside of, past the dining table still holding the wreckage of an interrupted dinner, past the hallway where my son's reflection had once smirked at his wife over my humiliation. The hurt of what Marcus had tried to do would sit in my chest for the rest of my life. A dull ache, no verdict or locksmith could fully repair. No father wants to believe the boy he raised could look at him and see only an obstacle standing between himself and an inheritance. But standing there in the quiet, surrounded by everything we built, the grief of that betrayal was outweighed, just barely, by the overwhelming relief of having protected it. I poured 2 fingers of Corinne's favorite bourbon into a glass, the bottle we'd been saving for an anniversary that never came, and carried it to the armchair by the fireplace. Her photograph sat on the mantel above the flames, the one from our 40th anniversary trip to the coast, her hair blowing sideways, laughing at something just out of frame. I raised my glass to her in the quiet. I kept it, Corinne, I said out loud to the empty room. I kept our home. The snow outside had started falling harder, blanketing the driveway, the barn, the woodpile where I'd hidden, and learned the truth about my own son. Somewhere out there, Marcus and Deanna were driving into a future they'd have to explain to a courtroom eventually. In here, the fire cracked, steady and warm, and for the first time since June, the house finally felt like it belonged to somebody who was actually still alive. Family is not a blank check that entitles anyone to your dignity, your labor, or your legacy. We are taught our whole lives to give without limit to the people who share our blood. But love without respect is not love at all. It's just an opportunity waiting to be exploited by someone patient enough to wait you out. If you let people believe your age makes you disposable, they will eventually try to prove it. Protect what you built. Trust the instincts that got you this far in life. And never let anyone, blood or otherwise, convince you that you are the confused one in a story you understand better than anybody else in the room. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell me down in the comments. Has someone in your own family ever tried to convince you that you were losing your grip on reality when you were the only one seeing clearly? I'll see you in the next one.